All right, Hokie Nation. It is unofficially basketball season. We are about 2.5 weeks out, I think, from the first game with the men and the women doubleheader in Castle Coliseum. So I'm back with Mike McDaniel for what is this, year 4 now, I think, of Hokie Hoops
Year
podcast.
4, man. Yeah, year 4, all
Yeah,
right.
we've come through some highs and some lows, both on the men's side and the women's side. They're the duration of our podcasting time together, but we're excited for this year. We're going to do a lot of content on both sides, men and women, all throughout the year long, covering both teams. But first, we kind of just figured the logical way to start out this season and this podcast would be to recap last year on both the men and the women's side, and then kind of just dig into the offseason. So that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to go through how the years ended for both programs, and then what took place in the offseason, and then in the next couple weeks leading up to the first game, we'll preview the entire year. But Mike, it was an interesting offseason. Some new faces, some guys who played a lot of basketball for Virginia Tech no longer here. But go ahead and dive into the men's recap and how the season ended last year.
All right, so definitely not how we envisioned that season going, right? Injuries, guys missing a lot of time, lack of backcourt depth, a lot of issues plagued the men's team last year, right? What ended up happening is Hokies went 19-15 on the year, 8-12 in conference play, never really threatened for an NCAA tournament berth. I know there was unlike a couple of years ago where the Hokies had a really strong month of February, I guess middle of January through February, there were a couple of signs, like a couple of decent wins in there. But really there was no consistent stretch of really good basketball in conference play last year. Hokies end up 8-12 in ACC play. Obviously that's not going to get the job done in terms of getting to an NCAA tournament. Year ends, right, with the 20-point loss in the ACC tournament to NC State. And then the Hokies, of course, lost in the NIT to Cincinnati as well in the opening round of that tournament. So I don't think anybody going into last season with what Virginia Tech had returning and kind of what the Hokies were adding anticipated that, Tech would only end up in the NIT and then would end up just losing after one game. Obviously, probably the most disappointing year that Mike Young has had in Blacksburg in terms of expectations, not necessarily meeting reality on the floor. So this sets up for a really important year 5, I think, for him and for his coaching staff. I think this is one of those years where Virginia Tech has a pretty good roster returning, right, in terms of guys with good experience and guys that gained valuable experience last year. A number of transfers that are going to get significant playing time that we're going to hear a lot about as well. And it sets up for a really interesting year because I think the Hokies are flying under the radar a bit, right? I don't think expectations are quite as high going into this year from the national media as maybe they were a year ago when Virginia Tech was coming off of an NCAA tournament appearance. But now I think the Hokies have a roster that's deep that can withstand maybe some of the injuries that they weren't able to withstand a year ago and gives the Hokies a chance to be really competitive, even if, they're battling injuries or guys missing time. I think the roster is definitely in a better situation in terms of number of guys who can play. Now it's just going to be a matter of, okay, can these guys step up? Can some of the transfers step up in big minutes and big moments in ACC play for the first time? And can guys take the next step, right? Can Sean Padula take the next step, maybe with, Mike Young called it gross overuse, right? On the Tech Sideline podcast, he talked about how Padula should have sued him for overuse last year because he was just really in a spot where he couldn't take Padula off the floor. Reminded me a lot of situation James Johnson was in when he was in Blacksburg with Devin Wilson. Really couldn't take Devin Wilson off the floor. Back when Tech was really only winning like 9 or 10 games a year, Devin Wilson was basically the only guy who could play in the backcourt for Virginia Tech. So it's going to be an interesting year. Obviously, disappointing year last year. Defense, a major issue, right, all year long. I think a lot of that can be fixed with just better depth. I think we're going to see that this year. And I would expect the Hokies to take a step forward defensively and then still be a real potent offensive team. So I think it sets up for a pretty good year for the Hokies on paper, even though they might be flying under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the roster in a second, and we'll probably dig more into some of those issues from last year and how they might be able to be fixed this year with the new roster, maybe on next week's episode. But the two main things that jumped off the page when I kind of, in hindsight, looked back at the season, it's kind of hard to think about it when you're in the season. But a few months removed now, obviously gearing up for a new year, and I went back and looked at last year, and the biggest issues by far were defense and depth. And I think both of those things will be fixed this year. And a lot of those issues kind of snowball and go hand in hand with one another, right? So, you lose Darius Maddox, Hunter Couture goes down with injury, Rodney Rice, you're missed pretty much the entire of his freshman year. Those three guys, injuries at various different times, put a lot of stress on Sean Padula to run the offense. Well, if you have all that stress to run the offense on one end, you're going to be really tired and have a hard time playing defense on the other end. So I think a lot of the issues kind of went hand in hand and created a snowball effect. And in hindsight, honestly, it's somewhat impressive that they were able to go 19-15 and almost win 20 games with really only one point guard throughout the year. A large part of that was due to the play of Justin Mutz and Grant Basile, two guys who are no longer here. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I really do think defense and depth were the two biggest issues last year, and you've heard Coach Young talk about it every time he's had a microphone in his face leading up to the season so far, how much emphasis they put on defense and how playable this roster is, top to bottom in terms of depth and guys who can contribute in the ACC. So I think both issues were addressed very well in the offseason. Time will tell. But overall, just a really frustrating year. Coach Young said it on the Tech Sideline podcast that you just mentioned, Mike. He felt like he had a tournament team last year. And I think if that team had been even remotely close to full strength for the majority of the year, he probably did have a tournament team in Blacksburg last year. I mean, if you look at look at their record, even if they somehow went 10-10 in ACC play and you're sitting at 21 wins, you might have a shot to get in at that point. So there was a lot of really close games where more depth and maybe better defense win you those games. And there was a lot of frustration, I think, from fans. Well, you shouldn't be in a position where you only have 1 point guard. Well, you can't really foresee 3 guards going down throughout the year. 3 of your top 4 guards going down throughout the year for various issues across the board. So it was hard to pin that one on the staff, in my opinion. I thought the roster was a tournament roster. Coach Young thought so too, and it just didn't play out that way. And sometimes that happens, but I think they're poised for a really good bounce back year in Blacksburg this year.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, okay, well, you should have had more than 1 point guard on the roster. Like, there aren't many teams in the country that can withstand the backcourt injuries that Virginia Tech had, right? Like, there are very few that, could have the injuries that Virginia Tech had in the backcourt and then still have guys who are top-rated recruits that can, step right in, play right away, and be good right away. Very few teams in the country could do that. A couple of them are probably in the ACC, right? But they're not Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech found themselves in a situation that a lot of teams would find themselves in if you had the injuries like that, right? So I think you chalk some of this up to really bad luck. I think you chop it up, you chop it up to the fact that Sean Padula, who, by the way, was thrust into a much bigger role as a sophomore than he has as a freshman. Played a lot his freshman year, right? But he wasn't the starter for the entire year, wasn't in the starting lineup. He was in the rotation, certainly, but wasn't a guy expected to just step right in and play the minutes that he had to play last year, right, as a freshman. So he steps in this new role last year, and then it becomes an even bigger role than anybody anticipated because of the injuries. And we were critical of Padula on this podcast for his turnovers and his defensive issues. And then as the year went on, you and I kind of took a step back and we were like, well, wait a minute, look what he's being asked to do. He's playing,
it's exhausting.
He's playing 35, 36, 37 minutes a night in ACC play in his role as really a first-time starter, right, on a full-time basis. It's a lot to ask of him just from a development standpoint. He had to grow up really quick. Now, it wasn't the best position to be in last year, but I think it puts him in position this year to be in a spot where he's going to, he's seen a lot. He's played a lot of ACC basketball now, right? Between freshman year and what he had to do last year in conference play. And I think it puts him in position this year to be really successful in terms of being comfortable in Mike Young's scheme offensively and what he wants to do, being more comfortable on the defensive end. And then with Virginia Tech's guard depth this year, being in a position where he doesn't need to play 36, 37 minutes a night. He can be more effective in the minutes he's in. So, if Padula struggles with turnovers and struggles with defense again in less minutes, then I think it's probably a more fair discussion to have, right? The discussions we were having at points last year, it's more fair to maybe point the finger at him if he's not performing well at that point in time. But I think he's going to be in a much better position this year to succeed just based on pure roster depth and the injuries last year that Tech was dealing with, and how the roster this year I think is better equipped, to handle situations like that a season could inevitably throw at you.
Yeah, I think there's Sean Padula, who obviously played a significant role as a true freshman, and then last year that role was increased mightily. And then there's also MJ Collins, kind of the two guys who are baptized by fire by necessity, right? You needed bodies. MJ Collins played a lot of high leverage minutes as a true freshman, and I think that'll aid in his development, just like it'll aid in Sean Padula's development as we head into this year, their true junior and true sophomore years. But enough with last year. It was a frustrating year that I think the ceiling was higher, but a lot of unforeseen issues there. One other point I did want to talk about with the roster from last year actually is, Coach Young has said it. They went into last year thinking that they had 2.5 point guards, and Couture being the half and Rice being the backup. Both those guys had significant time. So I think most programs in the country probably have that thought process when they head into a season. We have a primary ball handler, we have a secondary guy, and then we have an emergency guy. We lost our secondary and our emergency guy, and that put Sean Padula in a really unfortunate circumstance. So with that, we will move on to the women's team's recap from last year. Now, it might seem like we gloss over this, and it's not out of disrespect, but I just feel like it's been talked about a lot, especially on the Sons of Saturday channel and all Hokie sports channels. But last year was incredible. It was awesome to kind of have a front seat view at all of everything that took place on the women's side. 31-5, 14-4 in conference, ACC champs with that 75-67 win over Louisville. I was watching that game at Bronson Beer Hall in Ballston and Arlington with a bunch of people. It was super fun. I'll never forget that. That was an awesome time. Number 1 seed in Blacksburg, got to host the first 2 rounds of the NCAA tournament. I went to one of those games. The environment was amazing. As good of a basketball environment as I've ever seen in Blacksburg. And the buzz on campus even rivaled that of a football game. It was a really, really cool day to be in Blacksburg when the women's team got to host that NCAA tournament game. Super weird that they wouldn't let us play Enter Sandman, though. I mean, I kind of get it. It's an NCAA event. It's not a Virginia Tech event, but it was kind of a weird thing, even though the fans took it upon themselves to sing the song pre-tip. And then they went on to go to the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 and beat Tennessee and Ohio State to get to that Final Four, with the eventual loss to the national champ LSU in the Final Four, 79-72. A couple quick highlights. Everybody knows the Queens of Castle. They need no introduction. Liz Kitley, back-to-back ACC Player of the Year. She comes back this year for her 5th year, looking to make it back-to-back Player of the Year, which would be an amazing accomplishment. And then Georgia Amore just kind of burst onto the scene last year on a national level. We obviously all knew about her in Blacksburg as her career has progressed, but from a national scale, jumped onto the scene, MVP of the ACC tournament, Seattle region, most outstanding player, among numerous other accolades that I don't feel like rattling off, and I don't think Georgia will mind if I skip a few. But it was an amazing year for the women's team. Having Liz, Georgia, and Kayla King all come back this year, 3 core pillars of the program. It was just an amazing year last year, and looking to build on it heading into this season.
I mean, really important for those 3 players to come back too, right? King, Kitley, Amore returning on a team that's losing 2 starters in Kiana Traylor and Taylor Soule, right, to WNBA draft. Really important to have all 3 of those players return. It's a situation that puts Virginia Tech inside the AP top 10, right, on the women's side to start the season. And they're the highest ranked ACC team in that poll. They're going to be very good, right? Anytime you return 3 core rotational players, including an ACC back-to-back ACC Player of the Year and an All-American type point guard in Georgia Amore, this is a recipe for being ranked really high and having expectations really high. Kenny Brooks wouldn't have it any other way. Bring in a bunch of transfers, which we'll get into here in a few minutes, and another really good recruiting class. So Kenny Brooks has this thing rolling in Blacksburg. The only way to really top a Final Four appearance is just go to a natty and try to win the whole thing. So expectations are sky high going into this year. Obviously, on the women's side, being able to replicate anything like the year ago would be just an accomplishment in and of itself, right? To go to back-to-back Final Fours would be monumental from a program standpoint. Forget 1. If you go to 2, and 2 in a row for that matter, it's a gigantic deal. But I think what's going to be really important is kind of resetting expectations, right, for this women's team going into the year. Yes, expectations are high on national level because of who they have returning, and rightfully so. expectations really high because of how Kenny Brooks has built the roster, the transfers he's brought in to kind of supplement the 2 losses in Trailer and Seoul. But at the same time, like also understanding that last year was a really special season, and going to a Final Four is a really, really hard thing to do, right? So, if on the women's side, they were, to not make a Final Four, sure, the coaching staff, the team might see it as a failure and falling short of goals. But if they were to make another deep run, get into the second weekend of the NCAA tournament again, anything on top of it, once again, is a cherry on top, right? This is a really good team. There's no doubt about it. It's just really hard to get to a Final Four. So I just want to level set with the fan base, how special of a year last year was. This team can absolutely do it again. But it'll be hard to do. They acknowledge that. They know what it takes, though, too. And I think that's a benefit, obviously, having a bunch of veterans returning and now a coaching staff. It's, all the better for it, facing off against a national championship level team in LSU in the Final Four, and knowing kind of what it takes to make that next step, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, last year was so fun. The banner is going to look so sick in Castle. I mean, that Final Four banner is going to look so sick. One of my favorite Virginia Tech teams I've ever watched last year, the women's team, was so much fun. And I look forward to this year. I know I won't miss a single game this year. I'll watch every single game they play. They're must-see TV, and I look forward to this year. So with last year behind us, let's move towards kind of the offseason. So we'll bounce back to the men's side really quick here.
Yep.
So some just notable losses in terms of roster management and roster construction. So Justin Mutt's obviously no longer in Blacksburg. That guy played a lot of college basketball. Virginia Tech fans owe that guy a lot. He did a lot of really cool things in Blacksburg and was the epitome of a Hokie and embraced it to the fullest. I'll miss his energy, pregame doing the "Let's Go Hokies" chants out there on the court. That guy was the man. Wishing him all the success as he starts his professional career overseas. Darius Maddox left via the transfer portal. Kind of an unfortunate circumstance with him last year, just missing time due to some non-injury related stuff. And then go ahead and jumping in the portal and transferring. So that was a big loss, and it's sad to see Darius go. A guy who, forever in Virginia Tech lore with that shot in the ACC tournament to keep that run going, which led to the ACC title. So shout out to Darius Maddox. Going to miss seeing him in Blacksburg. And then Grant Basile, his 1 year in Blacksburg was a resounding success. That dude was a baller for the Hokies last year, and he has also gone on to start his professional career overseas as well. So congratulations and farewell to those 3. But with those 3 leaving, we were able to bring in some guys via the transfer portal who we're all really excited about. Tyler Nickel, a guy from Virginia who went and did his freshman year at North Carolina, hopped in the portal and came back to Blacksburg. That was a really close recruitment the first time. It came down to Virginia Tech and North Carolina. He opted to go to UNC for a year and then kind of came on back home to Blacksburg. I'll be interviewing him actually later this week, so look for that on your feeds as well. So Tyler's a guy I'm really excited about. All-time scoring leader in Virginia high school basketball. He can just kind of fill it up in all sorts of ways. I think he's like 6'6", 6'7", maybe even 6'8". Kind of a natural small forward who can shoot it from deep, get in the middle. Mid-range game is really solid, and then finish around the rim. So just a really, really good scorer who I'm sure Mike Young is going to have a lot of fun with on the offensive side. Makai Long comes in from ODU, kind of just a gritty rebounding specialist. I think a guy who will bring a veteran presence. This is his 5th year of college basketball. So really good rebounding, which I know is an emphasis for the staff in the offseason, getting better on the glass. So you bring in a guy like Makai Long, who's known for that. He'll also be a huge help defensively down on the interior to go along with Robbie Baran coming in from Northwestern, who I interviewed back in the offseason. I'll go ahead and tag that interview or bump that interview up on people's feeds so you can get to know Robbie a little bit. But play a lot of basketball for Northwestern in a really, really good conference. I saw him play actually at Maryland last year when Northwestern came to College Park. Really good player, great defensively. Again, another veteran leader who will help kind of police things on the defensive side of the floor and help elevate Virginia Tech on defense. And then a couple freshmen that came in, Brandon Recksteiner, point guard with unlimited range. That dude can shoot it from way, way out there. It's probably a challenge for the coaching staff to, rein him in and define what a good shot is for him because his range is limitless. And Jaden Young, a combo guard who can shoot it from deep, score on the inside. two really highly skilled freshman guards who I know the staff is very pleased with so far through, first handful of practices of their college career. So lost some talent, lost some veteran leadership, but then brought in more talent and some more veteran leadership. So hopefully things even out and the roster finds itself in a really healthy place. And then obviously need to note that Mike Jones, the coach, left to go to Maryland. So he heads back home to kind of his stomping grounds in the DMV. He's on staff with Kevin Willard in College Park now. So Mike Young went out and hired JD Byers from the Mike Rhodes coaching tree. Spent a lot of time at VCU and then most recently Penn State. He comes into Blacksburg, kind of known as a guard development specialist. And I know he's taken a huge role on the defensive side of the ball as well. So look forward to watching our guard play this year under the tutelage of Coach Byers.
Yeah, so we're going to learn a lot pretty quickly about some of these additions, right? Obviously, a lot of scoring punch here. Tyler Nickel coming in from UNC. Know he could fill it up in high school. Him coming in, I think, is really significant. A guy that the Hokies really pushed after on the recruiting trail when he was still in high school, lost out to UNC, but ultimately Mike Young gets the final laugh there as he ends up in Blacksburg anyway. Mekhi Long and Robbie Barron. So you talk about two guys who are going to have to add pretty quickly to the front court depth and potentially a much bigger role than that, obviously. They're going to be in the rotation as starters or otherwise. Brandon Rexsteiner, Jaden Young, two really young guys, obviously coming in as freshmen who could really score. We'll see what their role is going to be. I think off the bat, it's pretty fair to expect that there'll be some depth options for Virginia Tech, right? Now, will they crack the rotation? It's really going to depend upon how some of these transfers and how these, other guys start to develop. Somebody's still got to fill that Darius Maddox role, right? And whether that's Rodney Rice coming in a much bigger role, obviously, this year, or somebody else, like that role still needs to be filled, right? MJ Collins is going to have a significant role once again. Been really working on a shot in the offseason. Mike Young mentioned. And one thing that Mike Young said that I thought was interesting is that MJ is going to have to fulfill a much bigger role on the defensive end this year. He's hoping that MJ Collins can kind of be stuck on the opponent's best player, right? So that Hunter Couture can kind of be roaming, guarding the second best offensive player on the other team. That's in an ideal situation. That's how the Hokies would roll things out defensively. So, can some of these young guys crack the rotation? Are they going to defend well enough to crack the rotation? I think is going to be something to monitor. You mentioned that Mike Young's put a real emphasis on defense. He said he's watched more practice film than maybe he ever has, trying to get the defensive side of the ball right. You mentioned the JD Byers addition on the coaching staff, and he's really just been honing in on the defense with his addition. I think is pretty significant coming off the Mike Rhodes tree. Mike Rhodes teams are known for playing pretty good defense. So getting him in the building, I think, is really important. I think it's a good replacement for Mike Jones, who unfortunately, you'd rather have Mike Jones than not from a recruiting standpoint in the DMV. And what he brings to the table as an assistant coach, he's been around, and losing him is obviously significant. But I think bringing in JD Byers, I think, is a really important addition. So we'll see. There are some questions as far as how the Hokies are going to replace Justin Mutz and his defense and everything he brought to the table from a veteran leadership standpoint. But I do think there are guys in the building from a transfer standpoint and who the Hokies have already on the roster, right? When you think of, Lynn Kidd, is he going to have a much bigger role this year? Elijah Petit, what's his role going to look like as well in the rotation in the front court? There's some questions left to answer, certainly. But I think the Hokies definitely boast the depth. And I think speaking to this, and I didn't even mention Patrick Wessler, right, which tells you everything you need to know about the depth in the front court. I do expect Wessler to play some this year as well. So it's a deep team. Deepest Mike Young has had in Blacksburg, even with, some of the losses to the transfer portal and graduation. It'll be interesting to see how the Hokies kind of stack up, how they roll their roster out in the first game here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and we also didn't even mention John Camden, who
right.
The staff has mentioned in interviews has had a really good offseason and gotten a lot bigger and stronger and better. Actually, right before we clicked record, the team put out a couple clips, and one of them was a putback dunk by John Camden. So there's a lot of guys on this team who can play and will play. It's going to be interesting to see kind of how I always anticipate teams early in the year. The rotation starts out really big, and then it fine tunes itself as you get into conference play. It'll be interesting to see kind of who grabs a hold of some of those roles. In terms of the freshmen, you talked about, how their ability to crack the rotation. I do think the path is a little bit cleaner for Brandon Rechsteiner to crack the rotation and play a few minutes, just because of the nature of the point guard position versus the, kind of the two position, and who's on the roster. In terms of true point guards, you have Sean Padula, Rodney Rice can play point guard. Hunter Couture, you'd prefer him not to, right? If you don't have to. So Brandon's only got a couple guys ahead of him who he can fight with minutes for, maybe grab a few minutes here and there, give Rodney and Sean a break and play a little bit of point guard if he's gotten to where he needs to be. Whereas Jaden Young's battling with, again, Rodney Rice kind of as a two guard, MJ Collins on the wing, Hunter Couture, Tyler Nickel probably played three, so that doesn't really impact Jaden as much. But the path's a little bit cleaner for Brandon to get minutes as a true freshman. But again, I mean, there's so much depth at the guard and wing position that, you might not need either of them to play. And that would be a blood, because that means that nobody's hurt and everybody's playing, which would be a welcome sight in Blacksburg after how last year went. So that's enough of the men's side off season. Let's flip over to the women. So obviously after that historic year, when you're really good and you're beating really good people, it means you have really good people. So the Hokies lost Kayana Traylor and Taylor Soule from their starting rotation, both of whom got drafted into the WNBA, which was awesome for Coach Brooks and the Virginia Tech program to see that happen. So you lose Kayana Traylor, you lose Taylor Soule, you lose a couple other pieces to graduation. Taylor Guyman graduated. Deidre Gregg graduated. So among a few others. So there was a lot of roster movement this year for the women's team. They had to replace a lot, but fortunately they were able to retain a lot as well. Liz Kitley coming back, obviously huge. Georgia Amore going into her senior year. Kayla King coming back for her 5th year. Carly Wenzel coming off of her redshirt year. So those are the kind of the main 4 that came back. And then the staff hit the portal, right? As is this day and age. Matilda Eck coming from Michigan State can absolutely shoot it. That'll really help spread the floor for Georgia and Liz to have Kayla and Matilda on either side knocking down threes. Rose Michaud coming from Minnesota. Kind of the perception there is that she'll play the 4, replace a little bit of what Taylor Soule was able to bring to the table in terms of rebounding and aggressiveness and physicality. So I'm really excited to see how she continues to grow into her role in the Kenny Brooks system and get better. She had some success in the Big Ten at Minnesota. So that was a great pickup out of the portal. And then Olivia Sumiel, I think is how you say her last name, coming from Wake Forest. I think she's a 5th year, I believe. So played a lot of basketball in the conference, familiar with all the opponents that we'll obviously be playing. Probably has some good familiarity with Virginia Tech and what we're trying to do as well, just from playing against the Hokies so many times. So some more veteran leadership coming from the portal there, along with a top 15 recruiting class. 4 top 100 players coming into Blacksburg as true freshmen this year. It's an embarrassment of riches, and it's what you want to do, right? When you have success on the floor, you want to turn that around and have success off the floor in terms of recruiting and, parlay one into the other. So Coach Brooks and his staff were able to land a phenomenal recruiting class. Like I said, top 15 in the country, one of 2 programs to land 4 top 100 players. So it was a great offseason for the women's side. And, it'll probably take some time, right, for these portal players to come in and mesh with the vets in Georgia, Kayla, and Liz, who obviously know Coach Brooks and what he's trying to do like the back of their hand. So they'll be able to guide the transfer players and maybe even some of the freshmen along to get them up to speed in a place where the number 8 team in the country and the Hokies needs to be.
Hopefully it's as seamless with these transfers as it was for Kayana Traylor last year, right? Coming in from Purdue. Hopefully it's as seamless as that, because she came in, played really well. Didn't seem like the Virginia Tech offense missed a beat. In fact, it seemed like the offense really gained something when Traylor was in the lineup. So you kind of hope it's a similar transition. Obviously, every transfer situation is different, but Virginia Tech, I think the additions they made in the portal made sense, with Eck and Michaud specifically, adding 2 players from the Big Ten who have had success at both their previous stops. Olivia Sumiel, of course, from Wake Forest in the ACC. You mentioned the familiarity with not only the opponents, but also Virginia Tech. I think that's only going to help as well. So I think there are 3 transfer portal additions that made a lot of sense. I think they fill obvious needs on the Virginia Tech roster. You supplement with another strong recruiting class, something that Kenny Brooks has been able to do ever since he's been in Blacksburg. He's recruited well. He's gotten good players into the program. And it becomes a little bit easier to recruit as well when you're taking a team to a Final Four, right? And taking multiple NCAA tournament appearances. You build recruiting off of that, and obviously it's paying dividends for Brooks and his staff. So love to see that as well.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how Coach Brooks kind of stacks and prioritizes minutes early in the year too in the non-conference play. I know, when they were over in Europe, Georgia, Liz, Kayla, they didn't play much or at all. He's trying to, they've played a lot of basketball, especially how last year ended. When you go deep into the postseason, those minutes add up quickly, and I would think he would probably try to use some time early in the season to get some minutes under some people's belts who may need it. I think of backup point guard position, right? Carly Wenzel, Mackenzie Nelson, the true freshman. Somebody's got to give Georgia a break here and there. She can't play 40 a night. So, yeah, is it going to be Mackenzie Nelson or is it going to be Carly Wenzel? Who's going to be that secondary point guard? I think we'll find out throughout the early part of the schedule. Although the early part of the schedule is really hard because you have Iowa, second game of the year. But at a certain point, you need to find a way to get some of the young people involved so that they can help spell the vets as the year progresses because it's a long season. I think of Claire Strack, another true freshman coming in, finding ways to get her involved and get her comfortable so that she can help spell Liz as the season progresses. So it'll be interesting to see how the year starts. Obviously, you hit the ground running with that Iowa game, but then you have some more traditional non-conference games right there after it. That Iowa game is going to be phenomenal down in Charlotte. I fully intend to be there. Number 8 Virginia Tech versus I believe number 3 Iowa in the preseason AP poll. So amazing game. We'll preview the schedule more next week. I don't want to give away too much. Obviously, everyone can look it up, but the Hokies currently have number 3 games against number 3 and number 1 on the schedule. So it's going to be a tough out of conference schedule followed by a really tough ACC schedule. And I think Virginia Tech's going to need to find a way to build some depth in the early part of the schedule.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. Once you get past that Iowa game, especially you mentioned, it's a primetime game from the jump, right? One of those big neutral site games we see on the men's side all the time. You're getting it on the women's side here with 2 top 10 teams. It's going to get a lot of national publicity for obvious reasons, but kind of settling in after that. I almost think that some of those games that come after that Iowa game, it's going to be more important to kind of figure out what you have and who's playable. And you always get the big game off the bat, Ed, but you're going to learn a lot more about what this team is going to be and how this roster is going to look throughout the non-conference schedule.
Yeah, but now that I'm looking at it, there's really not a break. Like they go Iowa, and then they've got Houston Christian, UNC Greensboro, but then they go down to the Cayman Islands for the Thanksgiving tournament, and they play Kansas and Tulane. And then they go to Baton Rouge to play LSU, the defending national champs. And then they come back to Blacksburg for a couple before going up to Piscataway and playing Rutgers. So it's a gauntlet of a non-conference schedule, but that's what you want. You already have the target on your back coming off of the Final Four. Coach Brooks talked a lot about how he thought the impact of last year's Tennessee game in Tennessee in the non-conference helped build this team for success later in the year, playing a program of that caliber early in the year and kind of, hitting the ground running. And they really are doing that this year with this out of conference schedule. It's a gauntlet, but it'll be really fun to watch and provide for some really good basketball for Virginia Tech fans to watch.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. And I would just implore fans to be patient here because Virginia Tech is replacing some key pieces here. So, if that Iowa game or the LSU game, one or both or neither, right, go according to plan, I would just, just stay patient, right? The games in October, I guess November, the games in November and December don't matter nearly as much as the games in January, February, and then obviously into March. So just be patient as Tech finds, ways to integrate some of these new pieces with some of their existing stars, right? And it could look really good from the jump. They could also look like a team that needs some time to develop some chemistry together. Obviously losing a couple of really important pieces off last year's team. So
it's going to be fun to watch. I mean, you think about Iowa, obviously Caitlin Clark, probably, the general consensus best player in the country. She just had a triple-double in a game where 50,000 people were watching her play in a football stadium.
Right.
She's out of control. And then you go on to Baton Rouge and you have Angel Reese and Haley Van Lith and, everything that Coach Mulkey has going on down there. So they're going to play some really good teams and some really good players right away. But like we talked about, Virginia Tech is one of those teams as well with Georgia and Liz and Coach Brooks and everything they've accomplished. We have LSU has their Angel Reese and Haley Van Lith, and we've got our Liz Kitley and Georgia Amore, and we'll take that matchup every time. So It's going to be a really fun out of conference schedule. I look forward to seeing how some of these highly touted freshmen mix into the potential rotation along with the transfers. But I'm ready for basketball to start. This was a fun recap podcast. We'll get back on next week and dig more into, projected starting lineups and conference schedules and all that kind of stuff. But for now, I think this was a nice little appetizer as we head into the bye week for football and get ready for the season here in a few short weeks.
More hoops pods to come.
Go Hokies.